They thought he was just another old man with shaky hands and faded medals. They didn't know those hands once held the line between freedom and fear. They didn't know who they were laughing at, until it was too late. My dad was the kind of man who didn't need to speak loud to be heard. Every word from him carried weight, because it came from a place of truth, honor, and pain. He was a veteran, a man who had seen things most people couldn't even imagine. Yet when we moved into that perfect-looking suburban neighborhood with its clean lawns and shiny mailboxes, he became a joke to them. The HOA, the Homeowners Association, ruled that place like a little kingdom. They wore fake smiles and polished shoes, pretending to care about community standards. But underneath all that, they loved control. They loved power. And they hated anyone who didn't bow down to their rules. When we first arrived, Dad was excited. He'd saved for years to buy that house. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. The porch creaked, the yard was wild, but Dad said, "Son, this place has peace. That's all I ever wanted." But peace doesn't last long when pride meets power. It started small. A letter taped to our door. "Your lawn is non-compliant." Dad laughed it off. He said, "Guess they don't like wildflowers." But soon the letters kept coming. "Paint your fence. Trim your grass. Remove the flag from your porch. It's too large." That one hit him deep. The flag wasn't decoration. It was his memory. It was his brothers who never came home. It was his promise that their sacrifice wasn't forgotten. He walked to the next HOA meeting with quiet fire in his eyes. I remember his hands shaking, not from fear, but from holding back everything he wanted to say. He stood up, looked at the room full of smug faces, and said softly, "That flag stays." They laughed. Actually laughed. One of them, the HOA president, a man named Carl, smirked and said, "Sir, we respect your service, but we have rules here." Dad replied, "I didn't risk my life so men like you could tell me how to love my country." The room went silent for a second. Then Carl chuckled and said, "Maybe this neighborhood isn't for you." That night I saw my father sit on the porch in silence, staring at that flag swaying in the dark. I could tell something broke in him, not because of the insult, but because people he fought to protect, people living in comfort and safety, couldn't even show an ounce of respect. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. They fined him for everything. A mailbox too old, a fence too rustic, even the flowers not uniform enough. Every morning, another notice. Every evening, another fight with the HOA, but Dad didn't give in. He never did. He fixed everything by hand, quietly, slowly. Every nail, every brush stroke, every little repair was his way of saying, "You can't break me." Until one day Carl pushed too far. He came to our door, holding another fine, and said, "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to take further action." Dad looked at him, calm as ever, and said, "Do what you have to do." Carl sneered. "We'll see how long you can afford to live here." That was the last straw. Dad didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just stood there for a long moment, then closed the door slowly. Later that night, I saw him on his old laptop, typing something. His eyes had that same focus I'd seen in his army photos. Something was about to happen. The next morning, he told me, "Son, I've been quiet long enough. They think they can humiliate me. Let's show them what real power looks like." I didn't know what he meant, but there was something in his voice that told me this wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. The HOA had mocked a man they didn't understand. A man who had more honor in one scar than they had in their entire committee. And soon, they were going to regret every laugh, every insult, every fine they ever sent. The next few days were strange. Dad became quiet, but not defeated. He stopped reacting to the HOA letters. He didn't even open them anymore. He just smiled. A kind of calm smile that made me nervous because I knew that meant he was planning something. Every morning, he'd make his coffee, sit on the porch, and look around the neighborhood. He'd study every house, every yard, every detail like a soldier scanning a battlefield. "Dad," I asked one morning, "what are you doing?" He said softly, "Learning their weak spots." I didn't understand at first. To me, it was just a neighborhood. But to him, it was more than that. He saw how the HOA used control to scare people, how they used fear to make everyone follow their rules. And fear, he once told me, was a weapon, but every weapon has a weakness. He started visiting the town office, the county records, and the zoning department. He talked to lawyers, city planners, and even old real estate agents. I thought maybe he was just trying to find a way out, maybe sell the house and move somewhere peaceful. But I was wrong. One night, I walked into the living room and saw papers spread all over the table, blueprints, property maps, legal documents, and in the middle, one old photo of Dad standing in uniform, shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize. "Who's that?" I asked. Dad looked up, smiled, and said, "That's the man who built this subdivision 30 years ago." I frowned. "You knew him?" He nodded. "I didn't just know him. I served with him." That's when I realized my dad wasn't just living in this neighborhood. He had history with it. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Before this place became full of fences and fake smiles, it was just land, open, quiet land. We used to camp here when we were young. The man who owned it wanted to turn it into homes for veterans, a place for soldiers to heal and live with dignity." His voice cracked a little. But after he died, developers took over. They twisted his dream into this, a perfect-looking prison of rules. He looked me in the eyes and said, "That ends now." The next week, Dad started making calls. Real estate people, lawyers, even the city council. Every night he'd come home late, but smiling. I didn't ask questions. I knew better. Meanwhile, the HOA kept pushing. More fines. More letters. One day, Carl even stood outside our home taking pictures of the mailbox. Dad just waved. "Smile for the camera, Carl." Carl looked confused. Then something started to change. A few weeks later, residents began whispering. Rumors spread. People said someone had bought a massive portion of land that included most of the subdivision's common areas, the park, the pond, even the small clubhouse. Nobody knew who it was until the next HOA meeting. Carl stood at the front as usual, reading his list of violations and fees. His tone was smug as always. But that night, Dad walked in holding a folder. He didn't sit down. He walked right to the front. Carl sighed. "Mr. Thompson, this is not the time." Dad cut him off calmly. "Actually, it's the perfect time." He opened the folder, pulled out a few papers, and placed them on the table. "These are property deeds. As of last week, the land your HOA is built on, and including the playground, the pond, and this building, belongs to me." The room went dead silent. Carl laughed, thinking it was a joke. "You can't buy HOA land." Dad smirked. "Actually, I can, because you never owned it. It was under a private development trust that went inactive 25 years ago. So I bought the rights." Carl's face drained of color. Everyone stared at him, then at Dad. Nobody spoke for a long time. You could almost hear the weight of the moment pressing down. Dad continued, "You've been bullying good people with fake power. You mocked veterans, fined families, and called it community order. Well, order just changed ownership." Someone in the back actually clapped. Then another. Carl slammed the table. "You can't do this!" Dad leaned in and said quietly, "Son, I fought wars for this country. I've seen men bleed for freedom. You really think I can't handle a homeowners association?" The entire room erupted. Some people laughed, others cheered. The HOA board members looked lost, like their world had just cracked open. Carl tried to speak, but nobody was listening. Dad turned around, looked at everyone, and said, "This neighborhood was built on a dream for veterans and families to live without fear. I'm bringing that dream back." He walked out calmly while people stood and clapped. I followed him outside, heart pounding, realizing what had just happened. My dad, the man they mocked, had just taken control of the very ground beneath their feet. That night, we sat on the porch again. The same porch where he'd once looked broken. Now he looked at peace. The flag waved in the cool breeze, and for the first time in months he smiled like he used to. "You see, son," he said softly, "you don't fight people like them with anger. You fight them with patience, truth, and a little bit of paperwork." We both laughed, and I swear, even the stars looked brighter that night. But what he didn't know, what neither of us knew, was that the HOA wasn't going down quietly, and soon they were going to try one last desperate move to take everything back. When a man like my dad wins a battle, the world doesn't clap. It plots. The HOA wasn't done, not by a long shot. They'd been humiliated, and men like Carl didn't know how to lose. Their pride was louder than reason, and their obsession with control ran deeper than any law. For a week, everything seemed calm. Too calm, no letters, no visits, no noise. But Dad knew silence could be dangerous. "Quiet," he told me once, "is when your enemy reloads." He was right. The storm started again one Friday morning. A white envelope sat on our doorstep. No logo, no return address. Just one bold line on the front, "Legal notice." Dad opened it slowly. His eyes moved across the page, and I saw his jaw tighten. I'd seen that look before. The same one he had in his old army photos. The look of a man preparing for another fight. "They're suing me," he said calmly. I blinked. "For what?" "You own the land fair and square," he nodded. "They're claiming the sale was invalid, that I forged documents." My blood boiled. "They can't do that. Everyone saw the papers." He smiled slightly. "Son, people who hate losing will do anything to pretend they won." That night he didn't eat much. He sat at the dining table, staring at the letter like it was an enemy across the field. Then he said quietly, "They're not fighting for land anymore. They're fighting for control." The next day, the neighborhood felt colder. People who used to wave at us now turned away. Some whispered when we passed by. Others left notes on our porch, not threats, but cowardly words like, "Maybe you should move." The HOA had started a whisper campaign. They told people my dad was unstable, a bitter old man making up stories. They said he was trying to steal their community. Dad didn't fight back with words. He didn't post anything online or argue. He just worked in silence. Every morning he still raised his flag. Every evening he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, calm as ever. But I knew better, that calm was the same kind soldiers wear before they march back into battle. A week later, it got worse. We came home from the grocery store, and there it was, a bright orange notice taped to our garage, unsafe structure, pending demolition. My heart dropped. "They can't do this!" I shouted. Dad peeled it off slowly. "They can try," he said, voice quiet but steady. "Fear is their favorite weapon." Then he looked at me and smiled softly. But I stopped being afraid a long time ago. That evening he opened a file cabinet I'd never seen before, full of folders, papers, even old medals. He took out one folder labeled Service Contacts. He made calls, dozens of them, lawyers, city officials, veterans organizations. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He was looking for allies who believed in truth. 3 days later, we walked into the courthouse. He wore his best jacket, the same one from his military days with the faded patch still stitched on the shoulder. His lawyer, a sharp young woman named Emily, met us at the steps. "Mr. Thompson," she said confidently, "they don't have a leg to stand on. You bought that land legally?" Dad nodded, calm as ever. "Then let's finish what they started." The courtroom was packed that day. Half the neighborhood had shown up. Some to support, others just to watch. And of course there was Carl, sitting front and center, grinning like a man who thought he'd already won. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The case began. Carl's lawyer stood first, full of arrogance. "Your Honor," he began, "this man fraudulently obtained property belonging to the Homeowners Association. He manipulated outdated records to gain ownership." Emily rose next, calm but razor-sharp. "Your Honor, the HOA never legally owned the land. It was held under an expired development trust. My client purchased it through proper legal channels. Every document is verified and notarized." The judge nodded slowly, flipping through the papers. Carl's lawyer tried again. "Even if the sale is valid, the HOA has authority over the land's use." Emily smiled faintly. "Authority built on expired documents is no authority at all." "That's deception and not leadership," murmurs filled the room. Then Dad stood up. The judge looked at him. "Mr. Thompson, do you wish to speak?" He nodded respectfully. "Your Honor," he began, his voice deep but calm, "I'm not a lawyer. I'm a soldier. I've seen what power does to men. I've seen how pride can destroy everything good. When I moved here, I just wanted peace. But peace doesn't grow in places ruled by fear. These people mocked me for my service, for the flag I fly, for the land I worked for. I didn't buy that property to show off. I bought it because this country lets me. Because I earned that right." He paused. The room was completely silent. "I fought wars to protect freedom. And I'll be damned if I let a homeowners association tell me how to live it." Even the judge looked moved. After a long pause, the judge cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson." He looked at the papers again, then turned to Carl's lawyer. "The evidence is clear. The sale is legal. The HOA has no standing to challenge ownership. This court finds in favor of Mr. Thompson." Carl's lawyer looked stunned. Carl himself went pale. His jaw twitched, his face tight with anger. The judge continued. "Furthermore, this court recommends an internal audit of the HOA's practices regarding harassment and misconduct." The gavel slammed. "Case closed." A few people started clapping. Others whispered in disbelief. Emily smiled, shook Dad's hand, and said, "You just made history, sir." But Dad didn't smile. He just nodded and said softly, "No, I just told the truth." Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Neighbors came forward, some apologizing, others thanking him. A few even saluted him quietly as he passed. He stopped only once, turned to a small group of neighbors and said, "You don't have to fear people who bark orders. You just have to remember who actually owns the ground you stand on. That night, back home, we sat on the porch again. The flag waved gently in the wind. It looked prouder than ever, glowing in the soft porch light. He sipped his coffee, looked at the stars, and said, "It's over." But I knew my father too well. It was never really over, because the next morning when we opened our door, the word traitor was spray-painted across our garage in big red letters. For a long moment, Dad just stared at it. His hands didn't shake. His face didn't change. Then he smiled, not bitterly, but almost sadly. He turned to me and said quietly, "They think that word can hurt me. But I know who I am, son, and so do you. That's all that matters." He picked up a bucket of paint and started scrubbing it off himself. No shouting, no anger, just strength. Silent, calm, and unbreakable. And in that moment, I realized something. Heroes don't always fight wars on battlefields. Sometimes they fight them in quiet neighborhoods, against people who've forgotten what respect means. The word traitor stayed on our garage for a few hours before Dad painted over it. But even after the red faded, the memory stayed. I kept thinking about how cruel people could be, how someone could mock a man who once risked his life for strangers. But Dad, he didn't let it touch him. That night I asked him, "Doesn't it bother you, Dad, after everything you've done?" He smiled quietly. "It used to. Not anymore. Because I learned something, son. When people can't beat your strength, they attack your peace." He looked out at the flag on the porch. The stars on it shimmered under the soft porch light. "I fought for this," he said softly, "and I'll never apologize for it." The next morning, he did something unexpected. He called a community meeting, not in the HOA office, but in the park. The same park he now owned. Flyers went out to every house. Community meeting. All welcome. I didn't know if anyone would show up. But when the day came, people arrived, dozens of them. Some came out of curiosity, others out of guilt, and a few came just to see what the crazy veteran would say next. Dad stood by the old oak tree, wearing his worn jacket and that same calm expression. He started by saying, "I know many of you didn't agree with what I did. Some of you even think I'm the enemy. But I didn't buy this land to own you. I bought it to free you." People looked at each other confused. He continued, "For too long you've been afraid of letters, fines, and rules made by people who forgot what community means. That ends today." He took a deep breath and said, "From now on, this neighborhood won't be ruled by fear. It'll be guided by respect." A woman in the crowd raised her hand. "What do you mean?" Dad smiled. "It means I'm dissolving the HOA." Gasps filled the air. Carl, standing at the back with his arms crossed, looked furious. Dad turned to him and said, "Carl, you wanted power. I wanted peace. Now everyone gets a choice, to live with kindness or to leave with their pride." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then, slowly, people started clapping. One by one, they stepped forward, shaking his hand, thanking him, even apologizing. Carl didn't move. He just turned and walked away. And for the first time, the neighborhood felt quiet in a good way. Not the kind of silence that hides anger, but the kind that brings calm. Dad spent the next few months turning that subdivision into something new. He planted trees in the park, built benches for veterans, and started a small community fund to help struggling families with their bills. The same people who once mocked him were now helping him build something real. I watched him every day, hammer in hand, working under the sun, smiling like a man finally at peace. One afternoon, as we painted a bench together, I asked him, "Dad, why didn't you sell the land and move away? You could have left all this behind." He looked at me and said, "Because walking away doesn't change anything. Standing your ground does. You can't teach people respect by running. You teach them by living it." Those words stuck with me. A few months later, on Veterans Day, the town held a small ceremony in that same park. The mayor came, neighbors came, even children came waving flags. When Dad's name was called, people stood up and clapped, not out of pity, but out of pride. I saw tears in his eyes for the first time. He whispered, "They finally see it, son. Not the medals, not the fight, just the man." When the ceremony ended, he stood by the flagpole he'd built with his own hands and said one last thing to the crowd. "You don't need to go to war to be brave," he said. "Sometimes standing up for what's right in your own neighborhood is enough. Kindness is courage. Respect is freedom. Never forget that." The crowd went silent, then broke into applause. Even Carl, standing at the edge, lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but maybe, just maybe, in respect. That night, the sky over the neighborhood was full of stars. The air felt lighter, like peace had finally come home. I looked at Dad sitting on the porch, the flag waving above him, and I realized the HOA never stood a chance. Not against a man like him, because power built on fear can crumble in a day. But respect, real, earned respect, lasts forever. He didn't just win against the HOA, he changed the meaning of community, and maybe that's what real victory looks like. If you're listening to this story, right now, remember my dad's words. Don't let anyone control your peace. Stand your ground. Speak your truth. And never, ever be afraid to fly your flag.